The deafening crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Willow Creek as Ruby Reynolds ducked behind an overturned wagon, her heart pounding against her ribs like a blacksmith's hammer. The year was 1877, and the Arizona Territory was no place for a woman alone, especially one running from her past and straight into trouble. Ruby peered around the edge of the wagon, her amber eyes narrowing at the scene unfolding before her. Two men stood in the middle of the street, one clutching his bleeding arm while the other, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face shadowed by a worn Stetson, holstered his smoking pistol with practiced ease. "Consider that payment for cheating honest folk, Wilson," the man said, his voice low and dangerous as sand shifting before a rattlesnake's strike. "Next time, I won't aim for your arm." Ruby watched as the wounded man scurried away, leaving a trail of blood and curses in his wake. The victor stood unmoving, seemingly unbothered by the whispers that rippled through the gathering crowd. She didn't realize she was staring until he turned, his piercing blue eyes finding hers across the dusty thoroughfare. For a moment, Ruby forgot to breathe. She'd seen men like him before, dangerous men whose souls had been weathered by the harsh Western sun and harsher Western justice. Men who wore their guns like extensions of themselves and their scars like badges of honor. But something about this particular gunslinger made her pause. "Miss." He tipped his hat slightly, his expression unreadable as he strode toward her. "Might want to find better cover next time bullets start flying." Ruby straightened, brushing dust from her simple blue dress. "I wasn't hiding." "Could have fooled me." The ghost of a smile played at the corner of his mouth before vanishing so quickly Ruby wondered if she'd imagined it. "Name's Kieran Hayes, town marshal." So this wasn't just any gunslinger, this was the law. Ruby swallowed hard, fighting the instinct to run. Her experiences with lawmen had rarely been positive. "Ruby Reynolds," she offered cautiously, "just passing through." "Nobody's just passing through Willow Creek, Miss Reynolds." His eyes, the color of a summer sky, studied her with unsettling intensity. "People come here because they're running to something or from something." Ruby held his gaze. "And which were you doing when you arrived, Marshal Hayes?" Something dark flickered across his features. "Both." He gestured toward a building down the street with a weathered sign reading, "Henderson's Boarding House." "Sarah Henderson has clean rooms and asks few questions. Tell her I sent you." Before Ruby could respond, a young boy came running up to the marshal, panic etched on his freckled face. "Marshal Hayes, Pa says to come quick. Riders approaching from the north might be the Hollister gang." The transformation in Kieran Hayes was instantaneous. His posture stiffened, his hand moving to rest on his gun. The brief moment of almost warmth Ruby had glimpsed vanished entirely, replaced by cold determination. "Get inside, Miss Reynolds," he ordered, not looking at her as he strode away. Willow Creek just got dangerous. Ruby watched him go, wondering what had happened to make a man so young he couldn't be more than 30 so hardened. Against her better judgment, she found herself curious about the marshal with the sky-blue eyes and the shadow where his smile should be. Little did she know, their paths would cross again before the Arizona sun set that day. Ruby made her way to Henderson's boarding house, a two-story clapboard building that looked better maintained than most in town. The front porch was swept clean, and cheerful yellow curtains hung in the windows, a stark contrast to the tension now filling the streets. A plump woman with steel-gray hair answered the door, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "Can I help you, dear?" "Marshal Hayes suggested I inquire about a room," Ruby said. The woman's expression softened immediately. "Did he now? Well, any friend of Kieran's is welcome here. I'm Sarah Henderson." She ushered Ruby inside. "Don't mind the commotion outside. Happens every few months, some gang thinks they can ride through and take what isn't theirs." "Does the marshal always handle these situations alone?" Ruby asked, following Sarah up a narrow staircase. Sarah chuckled. "Kieran's not alone. He's got Deputy Jenkins and most of the able-bodied men in town ready to defend what's theirs, but he'll be the one standing in the street to meet them first. Always is. She showed Ruby to a small but clean room at the end of the hallway. It's not fancy, but the sheets are fresh and the window catches a nice breeze. It's perfect, Ruby said, setting down her worn carpet bag. It contained everything she owned in the world, a few dresses, a photograph of her parents, and a pearl-handled derringer her father had given her for protection. "Supper's at 6, Sarah informed her. "Rest now. Kieran will handle whatever's coming." The way Sarah said his name with such confidence and almost maternal affection made Ruby wonder about the relationship between the boarding house owner and the town marshal. "You've known him a long time?" Ruby asked. Sarah's eyes softened. "Since he was a boy. Before the war. Before he lost just about everything." She sighed. "He wasn't always so formidable. There was a time when that boy's laugh could light up a room." Ruby glanced out the window where she could see men taking positions, rifles at the ready. In the center of the street stood Kieran Hayes, as still as a statue, waiting. "What changed him?" Ruby asked quietly. "Life, dear, the war, loss, this territory." Sarah shook her head. "Sometimes I think there's nothing left of that boy I once knew, just the hardened shell of a man who's seen too much." She patted Ruby's hand. "But enough of that. Rest now. I'll call you for supper." After Sarah left, Ruby remained at the window, watching as a group of riders appeared at the edge of town. Even from this distance, she could see they were rough-looking men, heavily armed. She counted 7 of them, all on horseback, moving slowly down the main street. Kieran stood his ground, his hand hovering near his gun. The leader of the riders stopped several yards away, and though Ruby couldn't hear what was being said, the tension was palpable. For several heart-stopping moments, Ruby thought gunfire would erupt at any second. Then, unexpectedly, the riders turned their horses and departed, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Ruby let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Whatever Kieran had said had worked for now. As the townspeople began to emerge from buildings, clapping Kieran on the shoulder and offering thanks, Ruby noticed how he accepted their gratitude with stoic nods, never smiling. It was as if he'd done nothing more remarkable than chase off a stray dog. Ruby lay down on the bed, intending only to rest for a moment, but exhaustion from her journey overtook her. She awoke to a gentle knock on her door and Sarah's voice announcing supper. The delicious aroma of home cooking filled the hallway as Ruby smoothed her hair and straightened her dress. The dining room held a long table where several boarders were already seated. Ruby took an empty chair, nodding politely to the others, a middle-aged couple, an elderly man, and a young woman with a small child. The front door opened, and conversation halted as Kieran Hayes stepped inside, removing his hat. His eyes immediately found Ruby, and for a brief moment surprise registered on his face. "Kieran! Perfect timing!" Sarah called, bringing out a large pot of stew. "Sit down before it gets cold." He took the only remaining seat directly across from Ruby. Up close, without the shadow of his hat, she could see his features more clearly. His face might have been handsome once, before life had carved lines of worry and vigilance into his brow. A thin scar ran along his jawline, and another disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt. "Miss Reynolds," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Marshal," she returned. "I saw what happened earlier. Those men." "The Hollister gang," he supplied, accepting a bowl of stew from Sarah. "They won't be back. Not tonight anyway." "What did you say to them?" Ruby couldn't help asking. Something resembling amusement flickered in his eyes. "I reminded them that the last gang who tried to raid Willow Creek left in pine boxes." The elderly man at the table chuckled. "That's putting it mildly, Marshal. You told Jim Hollister you'd personally send him to meet his maker if a single shot was fired in town. And he believed you, added the middle-aged man. Men like Hollister only understand one language, Kieran said, breaking a piece of bread. And it isn't poetry. Ruby studied him as he ate, noting how the others at the table regarded him with a mixture of respect and caution. He was clearly valued in this community, but there seemed to be a distance as if he remained apart even while among them. After dinner, as the others retired to the parlor, Ruby found herself alone with Kieran on the porch. The night was cool, stars emerging in the vast Arizona sky. "How long will you be staying in Willow Creek, Miss Reynolds?" he asked, rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I haven't decided where I'm going yet." He struck a match, the brief flare illuminating his face. "Most folks have a destination in mind when they travel through these parts." "I'm not most folks," Ruby replied, watching as he exhaled a stream of smoke into the night air. "No," he agreed, his eyes meeting hers. "I don't believe you are." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant piano music drifting from the saloon down the street. "Those men today," Ruby finally said. "They'll come back, won't they?" Kieran nodded slowly. "Eventually. Men like that always do. And you'll be standing in the street waiting for them. It's my job." Ruby turned to face him fully. "Is that all it is? A job?" Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the hard veneer. "What else would it be?" "I don't know," Ruby said honestly. "But I've seen men who do things out of duty, and I've seen men who do things because they're driven by something deeper. You don't strike me as a man who simply does his duty, Marshal Hayes." He studied her for a long moment, then extinguished his cigarette. "You should be careful, Miss Reynolds." "About what?" "Trying to understand strangers." He stood, placing his hat back on his head. "Especially in a place like this. Good night." Ruby watched him descend the porch steps and disappear into the darkness, his words hanging in the air like the lingering scent of his tobacco. There was something about Kieran Hayes that called to her, something beyond his intimidating presence and the authority he wielded. It was the glimpse of something wounded beneath the surface, something that resonated with her own hidden pain. The next morning, Ruby woke early, determined to learn more about Willow Creek and its mysterious marshal. If she was going to stay even temporarily, she needed work. Her meager savings wouldn't last long. After breakfast, she ventured into town, noting how different it looked in the clear light of day. Willow Creek wasn't large, but it was more prosperous than many frontier settlements she'd passed through. A general store, blacksmith, saloon, and small bank lined the main street. Women in calico dresses shopped for supplies while children played in the dusty spaces between buildings. Ruby's attention was drawn to a small building with a sign reading Willow Creek Gazette. A newspaper might be a good place to gather information. Inside, she found a cluttered office where a bespectacled man was setting type. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, looking up from his work. "I'm new in town," Ruby explained. "I was wondering if you might know of any work available. I can read and write, and I'm good with figures." The man's eyebrows rose. "Is that so? Well, that's more than can be said for half the people in this territory." He extended his ink-stained hand. "Thomas Parker, editor and proprietor of the Gazette." "Ruby Reynolds," she replied, shaking his hand. "Actually, Miss Reynolds, I could use some help around here. My assistant left last month to try his luck in the silver mines." He gestured at the chaos of papers. "As you can see, organization isn't my strong suit." Ruby smiled. "I'd be happy to help put things in order." "Excellent! We can discuss payment over lunch." Thomas cleared a space at a small desk. "You can start by sorting these subscription records. I've lost track of who's paid and who hasn't." Ruby removed her shawl and set to work. As she organized the chaotic paperwork, she casually asked, "I met Marshal Hayes yesterday. He seems intense." Thomas chuckled. That's one way to put it. Kieran Hayes is the reason Willow Creek is still standing. When he took the marshal's badge 3 years ago, this place was on the verge of becoming a ghost town. Outlaws had nearly taken over. What happened? Hayes happened. Thomas removed his spectacles, polishing them on his vest. He rode in one day, took down 3 members of the Carson gang in a shootout that lasted less than a minute, and pinned on the badge of the marshal they'd killed the week before. Just like that? Just like that. Within a month, word had spread. Willow Creek was no longer easy pickings. Thomas shook his head admiringly. I've never seen a man so fast with a gun or so unflinching in the face of danger. He seems very solitary, Ruby observed, trying to keep her tone casual. Hayes keeps to himself. True enough. Sarah Henderson at the boarding house is about the only person who knows anything about his past. Thomas lowered his voice. They say he fought for the Union, came west after the war, lost his family somehow, wife, child. No one's quite sure. He never speaks of it. Ruby thought of the brief flash of pain she'd seen in Kieran's eyes the previous night. That explains a lot. He's a good man, though, Thomas added. Hard as nails when he needs to be, but fair. Treats everyone the same, regardless of circumstances. That's rare out here. As Ruby continued working, she learned more about Willow Creek and its inhabitants. The town had been founded 15 years earlier by silver prospectors, but the mines had played out quickly. Now it survived primarily as a trading post and stopover on the route to California. At noon, Thomas took her to a small cafe for lunch, where several townspeople greeted her warmly. Ruby was unused to such open friendliness after years of keeping to herself, but she found it strangely comforting. Their meal was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, Ruby saw Kieran dragging a struggling man toward the jailhouse. Drunk again, Thomas sighed. That's Bill Morgan, decent blacksmith when he's sober, which isn't often since his wife died. Ruby watched as Kieran handled the situation with firm efficiency, never raising his voice yet brooking no argument. There was something almost gentle in the way he guided the intoxicated man, despite the man's belligerence. He could have just let him sleep it off somewhere, Ruby commented. Not Hayes's way, Thomas replied. He'll lock him up, make sure he's safe, then release him when he's sober with a stern word about responsibility. Done it a dozen times. Ruby realized there was more to the marshal than the hard exterior he presented to the world. The care he took with even the town drunk spoke of a deeper character than she'd initially perceived. After lunch, Ruby returned to the Gazette office to continue her work. By late afternoon, she had organized the subscription records, cleaned the cluttered desk, and even drafted a few advertisements for local businesses. You're a marvel, Miss Reynolds, Thomas declared, examining her work. I'd like to offer you a permanent position, $3 a week to start. You can work whatever hours suit you, as long as the paper goes out every Saturday. Ruby was stunned by the generous offer. Thank you, Mr. Parker. I accept. Excellent. And please, call me Thomas. He handed her $3 silver. Your first week's pay in advance. You've already earned it today. With her newfound employment secured, Ruby left the Gazette office feeling more optimistic than she had in months. Perhaps Willow Creek could be more than just another temporary stop. As she walked back toward the boarding house, she passed the jailhouse. On impulse, she climbed the 3 wooden steps and pushed open the door. Inside, she found Kieran at a desk, writing in a logbook. He looked up, surprise crossing his features before his expression settled back into its usual impassivity. Miss Reynolds, he acknowledged. Something I can help you with? I just wanted to let you know I've taken a position at the Gazette, she said. It seems I'll be staying in Willow Creek for a while. Kieran set down his pen. Is that so? Thomas Parker's a good man. Fair employer. Yes, he seems to be. Ruby glanced around the small office, noting the wanted posters on the walls and the cells visible through a doorway at the back. In one, the blacksmith lay sleeping on a cot. "How's your prisoner?" A faint smile touched Kieran's lips. "Bill? He'll be fine once he sleeps it off." The anniversary of his wife's death always hits him hard. The unexpected compassion in his voice surprised Ruby. "You care about the people here?" she observed. "It's my job to protect them," he replied, his guard going back up. "There's a difference between protection and care, Marshal." Ruby moved closer to his desk. "You could have left that man to his misery, but you didn't." Kieran's blue eyes studied her intently. "You're very observant, Miss Reynolds." "Ruby," she corrected. "And yes, I've learned to be." Something shifted in the air between them, a momentary connection that neither fully understood. "Will you be at supper tonight?" Ruby asked, breaking the tension. "I have rounds to make," he replied. "But perhaps tomorrow." Ruby nodded, oddly disappointed. "Until tomorrow, then, Marshal Hayes." "Kieran," he said as she reached the door. "If I'm to call you Ruby." She smiled over her shoulder. "Until tomorrow, Kieran." The next few days fell into a comfortable rhythm for Ruby. She spent her mornings and early afternoons at the Gazette, organizing years of neglected files and helping Thomas prepare the weekly edition. In the evenings, she returned to the boarding house for Sarah's excellent cooking and the pleasant company of the other boarders. Kieran was often absent, his duties keeping him busy at all hours. When he did join them for meals, he was polite but reserved, though Ruby occasionally caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. On Friday afternoon, as Ruby was finishing her work at the Gazette, Thomas burst in with exciting news. "They're organizing a town social for tomorrow night," he announced. "After the harvest is in, music, dancing, food, the whole town will be there." "That sounds wonderful," Ruby said, genuinely pleased. It had been years since she'd attended any kind of social gathering. "You'll come, won't you?" Thomas asked. "Sarah's already promised to bring her famous apple pies." "I'd love to," Ruby assured him. "Though I don't have anything appropriate to wear for dancing." Thomas waved away her concern. "Stop by Harriet's Dry Goods. She'll have something suitable. Tell her to put it on my account. Consider it a bonus for all your hard work." Ruby tried to protest, but Thomas was insistent. "I haven't had the Gazette running this smoothly in years. You've earned it." Touched by his generosity, Ruby made her way to Harriet's shop, where she selected a modest but pretty dress in a shade of green that complemented her auburn hair. Harriet, a chatty woman in her 50s, insisted on adding a matching ribbon. "You'll be turning heads tomorrow night." "That's for certain," Harriet declared. "Perhaps even our stoic marshals." Ruby felt her cheeks warm. "I don't know what you mean." Harriet laughed knowingly. "My dear, half the single women in this town have set their caps for Kieran Hayes since he arrived. None have succeeded in cracking that shell of his." She gave Ruby an appraising look. "But I've seen the way he looks at you when you pass my window. Different than how he looks at anyone else." Ruby dismissed the woman's observations as simple town gossip, but she couldn't deny the flutter of anticipation at the thought of seeing Kieran in a social setting rather than in his official capacity. That evening at supper, Sarah announced the social to the boarding house residents. "Everyone's welcome. Of course. We'll have tables set up in the square, lanterns hanging from the trees. The Miller boys will provide the music." "Will you be attending, Marshal?" asked Mrs. Whitley, the middle-aged woman who boarded with her husband. All eyes turned to Kieran, who seemed uncomfortable with the attention. "I'll be there to keep order," he said non-committally. "Nonsense," Sarah declared. "You'll be there to enjoy yourself like everyone else. I won't take no for an answer." A ghost of a smile touched Kieran's lips. "Yes, madam." Later, as Ruby helped Sarah clear the dishes, the older woman confided, "It would do him good to remember he's more than just the law in this town. He's a man, too still young, with his whole life ahead of him. He takes his responsibilities very seriously, Ruby observed. Too seriously, Sarah sighed. After what happened to his family, he threw himself into being the marshal as if it were the only thing left for him. As if allowing himself any happiness would dishonor their memory. Ruby's hands stilled. His family? Sarah glanced around to ensure they were alone. His wife Emma and their little boy died of fever while he was away fighting in the war. By the time he returned home to Kentucky, they were already in the ground 3 months. He came west after that, drifting from place to place until he landed here. Ruby's heart ached for the loss Kieran had suffered. That's terrible. It is, Sarah agreed. But life goes on, whether we want it to or not. Kieran needs to learn that living fully isn't a betrayal of those we've lost. She patted Ruby's hand. Perhaps you might help him remember that. Ruby was startled by Sarah's implication. I don't think. I've seen how he looks at you, dear, Sarah interrupted gently. It's been a long time since I've seen any real emotion in that boy's eyes. You spark something in him, curiosity, maybe. Interest. It's a start. Ruby went to bed that night with her thoughts in turmoil. She hadn't come to Willow Creek looking for anything beyond temporary refuge. Her own past held painful secrets she wasn't ready to share. Getting involved with the town marshal, a man clearly carrying his own deep wounds, seemed unwise at best. Yet she couldn't deny the connection she felt to Kieran, the way her pulse quickened when he entered a room, the curiosity that drew her to learn more about the man behind the badge. Saturday dawned clear and perfect for an outdoor celebration. Ruby spent the morning helping Thomas distribute the latest edition of the Gazette, then returned to the boarding house to prepare for the social. Sarah insisted on helping her dress, arranging Ruby's auburn hair in a style more elaborate than her usual simple bun. With the green dress and ribbon, Ruby hardly recognized herself in the small mirror. "You look beautiful, my dear," Sarah declared. "Now come help me carry these pies before I'm late." The town square had been transformed. Lanterns hung from tree branches, tables laden with food lined one side, and a space had been cleared for dancing. It seemed the entire town had turned out, from the youngest children to the oldest residents. Ruby helped Sarah arrange her pies on the dessert table, then stood back. Suddenly feeling shy among so many people, Thomas spotted her and came to her rescue, introducing her to various townspeople she hadn't yet met. As darkness fell and the lanterns were lit, the Miller boys, 3 brothers with a fiddle, guitar, and harmonica between them, began to play. Couples took to the dance floor while others filled plates with food or gathered in conversation groups. Ruby was enjoying herself, laughing at a story Thomas was telling, when she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Kieran standing there, looking different than she'd ever seen him. He wore a clean white shirt, dark vest, and his usual dark pants, but without his gun belt and badge. His dark hair was neatly combed and he'd clearly shaved for the occasion. "Evening, Ruby," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Thomas." Thomas grinned. "Marshal, good to see you enjoying the festivities. If you'll excuse me, I need to speak with Judge Wilson about next week's editorial." Before Ruby could protest, Thomas disappeared into the crowd, leaving her alone with Kieran. "You look..." Kieran seemed to search for the right word. "Different. Nice." Ruby smiled at his awkward compliment. "Thank you. So do you. I almost didn't recognize you without your badge and gun." Sarah insisted I leave them at home tonight. He glanced around at the festive scene. "Said no one needs reminding I'm the marshal during a celebration." She's a wise woman. Kieran nodded, his eyes returning to Ruby. "Would you like to dance? I'm not very good, but I remember the basics." Surprised and pleased by the invitation, Ruby nodded. "I'd like that." He led her to the edge of the dancing area, placing one hand respectfully at her waist while taking her right hand in his left. His touch was gentle but sure as he guided her into the simple waltz the Miller boys were playing. "You dance better than you give yourself credit for," Ruby observed as they moved among the other couples. "My mother insisted I learn before I went off to war," he explained. "Said a gentleman should know how to dance properly." She was right. They continued in silence for a moment, the music weaving around them as they found their rhythm together. "I heard about your family," Ruby said softly. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Kieran's steps faltered slightly before he regained his composure. "Sarah told you. She cares about you." His jaw tightened. "It was a long time ago." "Some wounds don't heal with time," Ruby said, thinking of her own past. "They just become part of who we are." Kieran looked down at her, his blue eyes searching her face. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." Ruby held his gaze. "Perhaps I am." The music ended before she could elaborate, and they stepped apart. The moment of intimacy they'd shared lingered between them like an unspoken question. "Would you like some punch?" Kieran asked, breaking the tension. Ruby nodded, and they made their way to the refreshment table. As Kieran handed her a cup, a commotion erupted at the edge of the square. Raised voices and the sound of breaking glass cut through the festive atmosphere. Kieran's expression immediately hardened as he scanned the crowd. "Wait here," he instructed, moving swiftly toward the disturbance. Ruby watched as he approached a group of men who appeared to be arguing loudly. Even without his badge, his authority was evident in the way he carried himself. The crowd parted for him as he reached the center of the conflict. Two men stood toe-to-toe, one Ruby recognized as Bill Morgan, the blacksmith, and the other a stranger with the rough look of a cattleman. Several broken bottles lay at their feet. Ruby couldn't hear what Kieran said to them, but his calm, measured tones seemed to diffuse the situation. The stranger backed away, muttering something under his breath. Bill looked ashamed, nodding at whatever Kieran was telling him. Crisis averted, Kieran returned to Ruby's side. "Sorry about that." "You can't stop being the marshal even for one night, can you?" she observed, without accusation. He sighed. "Force of habit. Bill's still struggling, and that cattle driver was needling him about being a drunk. You handled it well. No guns, no arrests, just words." Kieran's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginnings of a smile. "Contrary to popular belief, I don't enjoy throwing people in jail or drawing my gun." "I never thought you did." Ruby placed her hand lightly on his arm. "That's what makes you good at what you do. You understand people." He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then back to her face. "Would you like to take a walk? It's getting crowded here." Ruby nodded, and they slipped away from the celebration, strolling toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open country. The night was clear, stars blanketing the sky above them. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached a large cottonwood tree beside a small creek that gave the town its name. Kieran stopped, leaning against the trunk. "You're running from something," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Ruby tensed. "What makes you say that?" "I recognize the signs, the way you watch the strangers who come through town. How you started when that cattle driver raised his voice, the way you keep your back to walls and your eyes on exits." Ruby looked away. "You're very observant, Marshal." "Kieran," he reminded her gently. "And yes, I am. It's kept me alive." He paused. "Whatever you're running from, you're safe in Willow Creek." Ruby turned back to him, studying his face in the moonlight. "How can you promise that when you don't know what it is?" "Because I'm here," he said simply, "and I don't let anything happen to people under my protection." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep inside Ruby. For 3 years, she'd been moving from town to town, never staying long enough to form attachments, always looking over her shoulder. The thought of stopping of being safe was almost too much to hope for. "My husband," she began, the words catching in her throat. My late husband was not a good man. He had business partners who were even worse. Kieran remained silent, giving her space to continue. When he died in a brawl 2 years ago, his partners came looking for me, convinced I knew where he'd hidden money he'd stolen from them. Ruby's hand unconsciously went to her side, where a thin scar remained from that terrifying night. I've been running ever since. These men, Kieran asked, his voice controlled but with an undercurrent of anger. Do they have names? The Sullivan brothers. 3 of them. They have connections throughout Colorado and parts of Kansas. Ruby shivered despite the mild night. They don't forget or forgive. Kieran stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring. They're not in Arizona territory. And if they ever come to Willow Creek, they'll regret it. The fierceness in his tone made Ruby look up at him. In the moonlight, his features were cast in shadow, but she could see the determination in his eyes and something else, something warmer that made her heart beat faster. I don't want to bring trouble to your town, she whispered. Our town, he corrected. You're part of Willow Creek now. The Gazette, Sarah, Thomas, they all think highly of you. He paused. So do I. Ruby felt tears prick her eyes at his words. I've been alone for so long. You're not alone anymore. Kieran's hand reached out hesitantly to brush a strand of hair from her face. The touch was gentle, almost reverent. I know what it's like to lose everything, to think there's nothing left but survival. But there's more, Ruby. There can be more. The vulnerability in his voice, the rare glimpse of the man beneath the hardened exterior, moved her deeply. On impulse, Ruby reached up and placed her palm against his cheek. For a moment they stood frozen, the connection between them palpable. Then Kieran lowered his head, and his lips met hers in a kiss so tender it brought fresh tears to Ruby's eyes. It was brief, a whisper of contact, but when he pulled back, Ruby saw that the walls he maintained so carefully had momentarily crumbled. The pain, the loneliness, the hope he kept hidden were all visible in his gaze. I should get you back to the social, he said, his voice rough. People will talk. Ruby smiled. People already talk. Harriet at the dry goods store informed me that half the single women in town have set their caps for you. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Is that so? Apparently, you're quite the catch, Marshal Hayes. And what do you think? He asked, suddenly serious again. Ruby considered her answer carefully. I think you're a man who's been carrying the weight of the past and the responsibility of the present for too long. A man who deserves more than just duty and obligation in his life. Kieran's hand found hers, fingers intertwining. You make me remember things I thought I'd forgotten. Good things, I hope. Yes, he said softly. Good things. They walked back toward town, hand in hand, the sounds of music and laughter growing louder as they approached the square. Before they rejoined the celebration, Kieran stopped. Ruby, he said, his expression serious. I want you to know I'll keep you safe. From the Sullivans, from anyone who means you harm. You have my word. The promise in his voice, the steel beneath the gentleness, reassured her in a way nothing else could have. For the first time in years, Ruby felt the tight knot of fear inside her begin to loosen. I believe you, she said simply. They returned to the social, where Sarah caught Ruby's eye and gave her a knowing smile. The evening continued with more dancing, laughter, and community warmth than Ruby had experienced in longer than she could remember. By the time Kieran walked her back to the boarding house, something had shifted between them, an understanding, a possibility neither had expected to find in this small frontier town. Good night, Ruby, he said on the porch, his hand lingering on hers. Good night, Kieran, she replied, reluctant for the evening to end. As she watched him walk away into the darkness, Ruby realized that Willow Creek had become more than just another temporary haven. It had become something she hadn't dared hope for in years, a place that felt like home. Over the next few weeks, Willow Creek settled into the rhythm of autumn. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler, and Ruby found herself increasingly comfortable in her new life. Her work at the Gazette kept her busy during the day, and in the evenings she often spent time with Kieran, sometimes walking along the creek, other times simply sharing a quiet supper at the boarding house. The hardened marshal was changing subtly. Sarah was the first to notice how he sometimes smiled when Ruby entered a room, how his customary scowl had softened, how he occasionally joined in conversations rather than standing apart. "You're good for him," Sarah told Ruby one evening as they prepared supper together. "I haven't seen him this alive since he came to town." Ruby blushed. "We're just friends." Sarah's knowing look spoke volumes. "Of course you are, dear." In truth, Ruby wasn't certain what she and Kieran were to each other. Since the night of the social, there had been no more kisses. Though his hand would sometimes find hers when they walked, and the way he looked at her often left her breathless. It was as if he was moving cautiously, afraid to disrupt the fragile connection growing between them. Ruby understood his hesitation because she shared it. Both had lost too much to rush headlong into something that could lead to more pain. Yet the pull between them was undeniable, growing stronger with each passing day. One crisp afternoon in late October, Ruby was working alone at the Gazette office when the door opened. Looking up, expecting Thomas, she was surprised to see Kieran. "This is a pleasant surprise," she said, setting aside her work. "Is something wrong?" "No," he assured her, removing his hat. "I just thought you might like to take a ride this afternoon. The weather's perfect, and—" He hesitated. "There's something I'd like to show you." Intrigued, Ruby agreed. "Let me leave a note for Thomas." 20 minutes later, they were riding out of town, Ruby on a gentle mare borrowed from the livery stable, Kieran on his sturdy bay gelding. He led them north along a winding trail that followed the creek upstream into the foothills. "Where are we going?" Ruby asked as they rode side by side. "A place I found shortly after I came to Willow Creek," Kieran replied. "I've never shown it to anyone else." The significance of his statement wasn't lost on Ruby. This wasn't just a casual outing, it was Kieran sharing something personal, something that mattered to him. After about an hour's ride, they reached a small valley nestled between rocky outcroppings. A natural spring fed into a clear pool before continuing downstream as part of the creek. Cottonwood and willow trees surrounded the water, their leaves golden in the autumn light. "It's beautiful," Ruby breathed as they dismounted. "I come here to think," Kieran said, tethering the horses where they could drink from the pool. "When the town gets too close, or when I need to remember there's more to the world than just trouble and lawbreaking." He led her to a flat rock beside the pool, large enough for both to sit comfortably. The afternoon sun warmed the stone, and the only sounds were the gentle gurgle of water and occasional bird song. "Thank you for bringing me here," Ruby said, understanding the trust implied in sharing his private sanctuary. Kieran nodded, looking out over the water. "I wanted to talk to you about something." Ruby waited, giving him time to find his words. "I received a telegram yesterday," he finally said, "from the U.S. Marshal's office in Tucson. They've been tracking a gang that's been robbing banks throughout the territory." Ruby felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "And?" "They believe the gang might target Willow Creek next. Our bank isn't large, but it's been doing well with the new copper mine operations to the south." He turned to face her. "I tell you this not to frighten you, but because I want you prepared. If there's trouble, I need to know you'll stay safe." The concern in his voice touched her deeply. "I can take care of myself, Kieran. I have for years." "I know you can," he acknowledged. "But I—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with what he wanted to say. Ruby reached for his hand, her fingers closing around his. "You what?" His blue eyes met hers. Vulnerability and determination mingling in their depths. I can't lose anyone else I care about. Not again. The simple admission, so difficult for him to voice, made Ruby's heart swell. You won't lose me. You don't know that, he said, his voice rough with emotion. My wife made the same promise before I left for war. Some things are beyond our control. Ruby moved closer, placing her free hand against his cheek as she had the night of the social. Emma's death wasn't your fault, Kieran. You couldn't have prevented it. I wasn't there when she needed me, he said, the pain of old grief evident in his voice. I wasn't there for my son. You were fighting for what you believed was right, Ruby reminded him gently. Emma would have understood that. Kieran closed his eyes briefly, leaning into her touch. How do you know what she would have thought? Because she loved you, Ruby said simply. And when you love someone, you understand the choices they make, even when those choices take them away from you. When Kieran opened his eyes, Ruby saw something shift in their blue depths, a loosening of the grip grief had held on him for so long. He turned his face slightly, pressing his lips to her palm in a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. Ruby, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never expected to find you. Nor I you, she replied truthfully. This time when he kissed her, there was none of the hesitation of their first kiss. His lips met hers with certainty, with longing held in check for too long. Ruby responded in kind, her arms sliding around his neck as his encircled her waist, drawing her closer. The kiss deepened. Years of loneliness and guarded emotions giving way to a connection that both had feared they might never feel again. When they finally parted, breathless, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. I don't want to rush this, he said. Whatever is happening between us, it matters too much for haste. Ruby nodded, understanding perfectly. We have time, Kieran. He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his face, erasing years of hardship and grief. Yes, he agreed. We have time. They remained by the spring until late afternoon, talking as they never had before. Kieran spoke of his childhood in Kentucky, of meeting Emma when they were both barely more than children, of the joy and terror of becoming a father. Ruby told him about growing up in Missouri, about her hasty marriage to a man who had seemed exciting and sophisticated, but proved to be dangerous and cruel. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they reluctantly mounted their horses for the ride back to town. The journey was quiet, both lost in thoughts of what had been shared and what might lie ahead. As they approached Willow Creek, Kieran suddenly reined in his horse, raising a hand for Ruby to do the same. His posture had changed, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. What is it? Ruby asked, alarmed by his sudden vigilance. Riders, he said quietly, pointing to dust rising from the far side of town. Too many, moving too fast. A premonition of danger sent a shiver down Ruby's spine. The gang you mentioned? Kieran nodded grimly. Likely. He turned to her, all traces of the relaxed man by the spring gone, replaced by the focused marshal. Ride to the Henderson place. Tell Sarah what's happening. Stay there until I come for you. But I need to know you're safe, he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. Please, Ruby. The earnestness in his plea convinced her. Be careful, she urged. He leaned across the space between their horses, pressing a quick, hard kiss to her lips. Go now, quickly. Ruby wheeled her mare around and galloped toward the boarding house, her heart pounding with fear not for herself, but for the man riding toward danger instead of away from it. At the boarding house, she found Sarah in the kitchen. Kieran thinks the bank robbers are coming, Ruby explained breathlessly. He asked me to tell you and stay here. Sarah's face paled, but she remained calm. I'll get the shotgun, she said, moving to a cabinet near the back door. Go upstairs and tell the others to stay in their rooms, away from windows. Ruby did as instructed, warning the Whitleys and elderly Mr. Peterson of the potential danger. When she returned downstairs, Sarah had loaded the shotgun and was peering out the front window. "Anything?" Ruby asked. "Not yet," Sarah replied. "But Kieran will have alerted Deputy Jenkins and the others by now. They've prepared for this possibility." Even as she spoke, they heard gunshots from the direction of the bank, followed by shouting and more gunfire. Ruby's hands clenched into fists as she fought the urge to run toward the sound, toward Kieran. "He knows what he's doing," Sarah said, as if reading her thoughts. "This isn't his first gunfight." "That doesn't make it any less dangerous," Ruby countered. The gunfire continued, seeming to move through town. Through the window, Ruby caught glimpses of townspeople running for cover. Then came the thunder of hoofbeats as riders galloped down the main street, men with bandanas covering their faces, saddlebags bulging. "They're getting away," Ruby whispered. "Maybe not," Sarah replied, pointing. At the edge of town, Ruby saw Kieran and several other men on horseback in pursuit. Her heart lurched at the sight of him, rifle in hand, determination evident even at a distance. "Now we wait," Sarah said, lowering the shotgun, "and pray." The next hours were among the longest of Ruby's life. As darkness fell, lamps were lit throughout town, creating pools of light in the gathering gloom. From the boarding house porch, Ruby could see people moving about, checking on neighbors, assessing damage. Finally, just as Ruby was considering going into town to seek information, riders appeared at the edge of her vision. Kieran was among them, and relief flooded through her at the sight of him, apparently unharmed. She ran down the steps as he dismounted, throwing herself into his arms without regard for who might be watching. His arms closed around her, solid and warm and alive. "You're all right," she breathed against his chest. "I'm all right," he confirmed, holding her tightly for a moment before stepping back to look at her. "And you stayed safe, as promised." "What happened?" Ruby asked as Sarah joined them on the porch. "They hit the bank, but we were ready for them," Kieran explained. "No one in town was seriously hurt. We managed to wound 2 of them and recover most of the money." "And the rest of the gang?" Sarah inquired. Kieran's expression hardened. "Got away for now. But we've sent telegrams to every settlement within 50 miles. They won't get far." He looked exhausted, Ruby realized, noting the lines of fatigue around his eyes and the dust covering his clothes. "You need to rest," she said firmly, "and eat something." "I need to check on the prisoners first," he insisted. "Make sure they're secure for the night." "I'll have food waiting when you return," Sarah promised. "Don't dawdle too long, young man." A faint smile touched Kieran's lips at her motherly tone. "Yes, madam." He turned to Ruby. "I'll be back soon." True to his word, Kieran returned within the hour. By then, Sarah had prepared a hearty meal, and the other boarders had gathered in the dining room, eager for news of the excitement. Ruby watched as Kieran patiently answered their questions, downplaying his own role in thwarting the robbery while praising the townspeople who had helped. He was different with them now. She noticed, still reserved, but more engaged, less distant. After the meal, as the others retired to their rooms, Kieran and Ruby found themselves alone on the porch. The night was clear and cool, stars bright overhead. "I was worried about you today," Ruby admitted, her voice soft in the darkness. Kieran took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said quickly. "It's who you are, who you need to be for this town. I understand that." He was silent for a moment, his eyes on their joined hands. "There was a time when I thought the badge was all I had left," he finally said, "that keeping people safe, enforcing the law, it was the only purpose I had anymore." Ruby waited, sensing he had more to say. "But today, when I was riding after those men, all I could think about was getting back to you." He looked up, meeting her gaze, and I realized that somewhere along the way, without my noticing, you'd become my reason for coming home. The simple honesty of his words touched Ruby deeply. Kieran, I know it hasn't been long, he continued, and we both have pasts that have shaped us in ways that make trust difficult. But I know what I feel, Ruby. I know it's real. Ruby reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. I feel it too, she whispered, and it terrifies me almost as much as it makes me happy. His smile was tender as he captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her fingertips. We can be terrified together then. The weeks following the attempted bank robbery were busy ones for Willow Creek. The telegraph lines hummed with news of the gang's capture in a town 40 miles west. The bank implemented new security measures, and life gradually returned to normal. For Ruby and Kieran, however, nothing was quite the same. Their relationship deepened as autumn gave way to winter, each day bringing new discoveries about each other and new reasons to look toward a shared future. Christmas approached, bringing with it preparations for the town's holiday celebrations. Ruby found herself enlisted to help with everything from decorating the church to organizing a children's pageant. The work was joyful, made more so by the sense of belonging she felt among the people of Willow Creek. One snowy evening in mid-December, Kieran invited Ruby to join him for a ride in the sleigh he'd borrowed from the Whitleys. Bundled in warm blankets, they glided through the snowy landscape, the only sounds the jingle of the harness bells and the soft shush of runners on snow. "Where are we going?" Ruby asked, nestled against Kieran's side. "You'll see," he replied mysteriously. They followed the creek north, the familiar route to the spring, though now the landscape was transformed by winter's touch. When they reached the small valley, Ruby gasped in delight. The cottonwoods were strung with lanterns, casting a warm glow over the snow-covered ground. Near the spring, now partially frozen, a small fire burned cheerfully. "How did you manage this?" Ruby asked as Kieran helped her from the sleigh. "I had help," he admitted. "Thomas and young Jimmy from the livery came out earlier to set everything up." He led her to the fire, where a blanket had been spread on a dry patch of ground. From a basket, he produced a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, along with bread, cheese, and preserved fruits. "This is wonderful," Ruby said, accepting the glass he offered. Kieran settled beside her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I wanted this to be special." There was something in his voice that made Ruby's heart beat faster. "Any particular reason?" Instead of answering immediately, Kieran reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small box. Ruby's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a simple but elegant gold ring set with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it with me since I left Kentucky, not knowing why I kept it all these years." He took her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "Now I know. I was waiting for you, Ruby." Tears welled in her eyes as he continued. "I know we haven't known each other long by some standards, and I know both of us thought we'd never find this kind of happiness again. But I love you, Ruby Reynolds. I want to build a life with you, here in Willow Creek, or wherever our path leads us." He slipped from the blanket to one knee in the snow. "Will you marry me?" Ruby's heart felt so full it might burst. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Kieran Hayes, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. They were married on New Year's Day, 1878, in the small church in Willow Creek. Sarah, teary-eyed with happiness, stood beside Ruby, while Thomas served as Kieran's best man. The entire town turned out for the celebration that followed, filling the decorated town hall with laughter, music, and well wishes for the couple who had found each other against all odds. As they danced together for the first time as husband and wife, Ruby looked up at Kieran, marveling at the change in him. The hardened marshal was still there in the watchful eyes that occasionally scanned the room, in the strength of his shoulders and the confidence of his bearing. But there was softness too, in the smile that now came more readily, in the gentleness of his hands holding hers, in the love that shone plainly in his eyes for all to see. "What are you thinking?" he asked, noticing her scrutiny. Ruby smiled, remembering the guarded man she'd first encountered in the dusty street months ago. "I was thinking that when I first met you, I thought you'd become too hardened by life to ever let anyone close again." Kieran drew her nearer, his voice low and meant only for her. "You're my only soft place, Ruby Hayes, the only one I need." As spring arrived in Willow Creek, bringing with it new growth and renewal, Ruby and Kieran settled into their life together. They had moved into a small house near the edge of town, close enough for Kieran to reach the jailhouse quickly if needed, but with enough land for the garden Ruby had always wanted. The town continued to grow and prosper, with new settlers arriving regularly, drawn by the stability and safety Kieran's leadership provided. Ruby's work at the Gazette expanded to include a weekly column on town happenings, which quickly became one of the paper's most popular features. One warm evening in May, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ruby turned to her husband with a smile that held a secret. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a child, Kieran. In the autumn." The play of emotions across his face: surprise, joy, momentary fear, and then overwhelming love was something Ruby knew she would remember all her days. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "A child," he whispered against her hair. "Our child." Later that night, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Kieran confessed his fears. "What if I'm not ready? What if I can't protect you both?" Ruby placed her hand against his cheek, a gesture that had become their own private language of reassurance. "You are the strongest, bravest man I know, Kieran Hayes, and you have the most generous heart, though you try to hide it." She smiled in the darkness. "Our child will be blessed to have you as a father." In the months that followed, Kieran surprised not only Ruby, but the entire town with his response to the impending arrival. The man who had once kept everyone at a distance became almost openly affectionate with his wife, placing a protective hand on her growing belly in public, bringing her wild flowers he found on his rounds, building a cradle with his own hands for the baby's arrival. "I've never seen him like this," Sarah confided to Ruby during one of their regular visits. "It's as if he's finally allowing himself to hope again, to believe in futures instead of just surviving the present." Ruby, her hand resting on her rounded belly where their child grew stronger each day, smiled. "That's exactly what it is." On a crisp October day, with leaves turning gold on the cottonwoods along the creek, Ruby gave birth to a daughter they named Emma Sarah Hayes, honoring both the wife Kieran had lost and the woman who had become a mother to them both in Willow Creek. As Kieran held his tiny daughter for the first time, tears streaming unashamedly down his face, Ruby saw the final walls around his heart crumble completely. The hardened marshal, the man who had once believed he had nothing left but duty and obligation, was transformed by the miracle of new life in his arms. "She's perfect," he whispered, gazing in wonder at the infant with Ruby's auburn hair and his blue eyes. "Absolutely perfect." In the years that followed, Willow Creek continued to thrive under Kieran's protection. 2 years after Emma's birth, Ruby gave birth to a son they named Thomas James for the friends who had become family to them. Kieran remained marshal, his reputation for fairness and courage spreading throughout the territory. There were still dangers to face: Still moments when Ruby watched him ride out to confront some threat with her heart in her throat. But he always returned to her, to their children, to the home they had built together. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they rode together to the spring that had become their special place, now familiar to their children as well, though on this day, they came alone. The winter had been mild, and already wildflowers dotted the grass surrounding the clear pool. "Do you ever think about how differently our lives might have turned out if you hadn't come to Willow Creek?" Kieran asked as they sat together on their familiar rock. Ruby considered the question. "Sometimes. I might have kept running, never finding a place to belong. And you?" "I would have continued existing, but not living," he said simply, "doing my job, protecting the town, but never knowing what I was missing." He took her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm in the gesture that still made her heart flutter after all these years. "You saved me, Ruby Hayes. You and our children. You gave me back the parts of myself I thought were gone forever." Ruby leaned against him, content in the knowledge that their love, born in a small frontier town, against all odds and expectations, had not only endured, but flourished, changing them both in ways neither could have imagined. "We saved each other," she corrected gently, "and we'll keep on doing it, every day, for the rest of our lives." As they rode back to town, to their children, to the life they had built together, Kieran Hayes, once the hardened marshal of Willow Creek, smiled at the woman who had shown him there was more to life than survival, more to love than loss, more to himself than the badge he wore. In a world that often demanded hardness for survival, they had found in each other the courage to be soft, to be vulnerable, to be truly alive. And in doing so, they had discovered the greatest strength of all, the strength to love completely, without reservation or fear. It was all either of them had ever truly needed.